In this video, I'll show you how to shade flat surfaces with pen and ink using hatching and crosshatching. Shading a cube can be a good way of going from two-dimensional value scales to three-dimensional subjects because a cube is three-dimensional, but it's made of two-dimensional surfaces. Each face is two-dimensional if you look at it straight on, but if you look at it from a different angle, then it looks three-dimensional. It goes into perspective. Perspective matters when you're shading in pen and ink because your hatching lines can look bad if you don't draw them in perspective, so you need to know how to draw a cube in perspective. This video is not about perspective, but I'll tell you what I did here so you can follow along if you want to. I started by drawing some guidelines in pencil. I drew a horizon line and I made 2 points on that line. These are called vanishing points. The distance between them is important. If the vanishing points are too close together, the perspective will get distorted. I made these vanishing points 8 inches apart. Then I made a third point at the center of the horizon line. I drew a vertical line through that point and I made 2 points on that line, 1 inch and 2 inches down from the horizon line. Then I drew lines from each of these points to each of the vanishing points. When lines get close together as they approach a vanishing point, they're called converging lines, and I'll talk later about why this matters when you're hatching. I made 2 more points on the horizon line, about 5/8 of an inch from the center, and I drew vertical lines through those points to make 2 sides of a cube. There are better ways of finding the sides of a cube in perspective, but this is close enough for shading practice. Then I drew lines from the top corner of each of these sides to each of the vanishing points to make the top side of the cube. To make a shadow, I drew horizontal lines through the bottom corners. I made a point 5/16 of an inch from the bottom right corner, and then I drew a line through that point to each of the vanishing points. There, we've got a cube in perspective, and I'll use this same cube throughout this video. In this video, I'll make pencil guidelines for my hatching. These guidelines are 1/8 of an inch apart. You don't need to do this when you're drawing, but it can be a good way to practice so that you get used to making consistent shades of gray with evenly spaced lines based on the value scales that I showed you in part 1 of this series. The light is coming from the left, but the sun is high in the sky, so the cube is casting a small shadow. The top face of the cube will have the lightest value, the right face will have a darker value, and the left face will have a value somewhere in between. The shadow will have the darkest value in this example. Going back to the value scales, I kept the top face white. I used value 2 for the left side, which I hatched with a Micron 005 fineliner pen with 1/16 of an inch between the centers of the lines. I used value 4 for the right face, which I hatched with a Micron 12 with 1/16 of an inch between the centers. And I used black for the shadow. So you can see how it's easy to go from shading two-dimensional value scales to three-dimensional cubes. However, you need to think about the direction in which you hatch. If you hatch with horizontal lines on a vertical face, your cube can look flat, as in two-dimensional and not three-dimensional. And that can be a problem. If you hatch with lines that are parallel to the edges of your cube, it can look better. Vertical hatching looks good on vertical faces. In this 2-point perspective drawing, the vertical edges are parallel to one another. They're not converging lines. The vertical hatching is parallel to the vertical edges of the cube. It's hatching in perspective, and I think it looks good. Diagonal hatching can also look good on vertical faces. The problem is that these diagonal edges are converging lines. So if you hatch parallel to one of those edges, then your hatching won't be parallel to the other edge, and that can look like a mistake. If instead you hatch in perspective, if you make your hatching lines converge at the vanishing point, just as the edges do, it makes it easier to see the three-dimensional form of the cube. But there is a problem with hatching lines that converge. The front edge of the cube is taller than the back edge because of perspective, and so the hatching may look lighter at the front and darker at the back. I'll try to show you what I mean, but it may be hard to see. Here's a cube that I drew using vanishing points that were only 4 inches apart, so it's more distorted than before. When I hatch it diagonally in perspective, the hatching lines are farther apart at the front and closer together at the back. And what do we know about lines that are far apart or close together? They look like different shades of gray. So instead of an even shade of gray, I made a gradient that goes from a lighter gray at the front to a darker gray at the back. I hope you can see that on the right side, for example, the lines are about value 4 at the front, but as they converge, they move towards value 5 or even darker at the back, where there is almost no space between the lines. And that can look like a mistake if you're trying to make an even shade of gray. So what are the solutions to this problem? You can use vertical hatching, since the vertical lines don't converge in this 2-point perspective, and so there is no problem when hatching in perspective, as I showed you before. Or if you use a flexible pen, such as this Gillette 303 dip pen, then you can use diagonal hatching in perspective, and you can vary the line weight from thicker at the front to thinner at the back to counteract the gradient. But this is hard to do, and I think I made it look too dark at the front here. Or you can use diagonal hatching lines that are not in perspective, but are also not parallel to any of the edges of that face. I don't think diagonal hatching has the same flattening effect as horizontal hatching. Or if you want to use cross-hatching, then there may not seem to be as much of a gradient from front to back if only some of the hatching lines converge. For example, only the diagonal lines converge in this two-point perspective, not the vertical lines. Sometimes you may not be trying to make an even shade of gray. You may want a gradient. For example, light can bounce back onto the cube from the surface that it's sitting on, and that can make it look lighter at the bottom than it does at the top. This is called reflected light. So you may want the right side of the cube to be lighter at the bottom and darker at the top. You can also shade using dots instead of lines if you want. This is called stippling. I think stippling looks great. You don't have to worry about line direction or such careful pen control, and you can use stippling to make smooth gradients. This is another example of reflected light, but stippling can be very slow, and that's why I'm focusing on hatching and cross-hatching in this series. You can shade with or without an outline. If you don't use an outline, you might need to shade all of the faces, including the top face, so that you can still see the edges of the cube when you erase your pencil guidelines. If you do use an outline, you don't need to make it go all the way around your cube if you don't want to. For example, you can use dashed or dotted outlines in the lighter areas and solid outlines in the darker areas. So, how do you shade a clear sky? That seems like it ought to be easy at this point because a clear sky is a flat surface, and we know how to shade a flat surface. A clear sky often has a gradient from darker gray at the top to lighter gray at the bottom at the horizon because of something called atmospheric perspective. But we know how to shade a gradient. It's just like making a value scale. What may be hard about shading a sky is its size. Even if you're comfortable with smaller subjects, such as these cubes in which your hatching lines are maybe only an inch long, you may not be comfortable with larger subjects, in which your hatching lines might need to be as wide as the whole page. It can take really careful pen control. It can also take a long time to fill such a large area with hatching. Honestly, even letter paper can seem really large when you're hatching all over a drawing. Cross-hatching can be even slower, and stippling can be almost impossibly slow over such a large area. So what are the solutions to this problem? Well, you can make pencil guidelines. You can draw from your arm instead of your wrist or your fingers to get longer, straighter lines. And I like to put a playing card under my hand and put tracing paper between the card and my drawing so that my hand can move smoothly over the paper. Even so, it's easy to make mistakes over such a large area of smooth gray. You don't have to make lines that are as long as the sky is wide. You can make shorter lines and try to blend them together into a smooth gray. Cross-hatching can help with this because the lines in one layer of hatching can cover the breaks between patches of hatching in another layer. You can also hatch in more than one direction, making small patches of hatching that cover the whole sky. Here are some examples of hatching by Franklin Booth, who was a master of pen and ink. In this drawing, he shaded the sky with these long hatching lines, but even here you can see some smaller patches of hatching which break up the sky a bit. In this drawing, there are also a lot of large, flat surfaces, and you can see that he shaded this wall using smaller patches of hatching with lines that go in different directions and different patches, but he shaded the floor using longer lines that go in the same direction. These longer lines have different line weights and places because the floor is dark but also shiny, so you can see reflections in it. I hope these examples have given you a sense of how good shading can look in pen and ink, even if you're only shading something as seemingly simple as a flat surface. But Franklin Booth was a master, so try not to get frustrated if you can't do this yet. In part 3 of this series, I'll show you how to shade curved surfaces, such as spheres, which are harder than flat surfaces. And in part 4, I'll show you how to shade faces, which are actually not as hard as you might think. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more videos about pen and ink. Thanks for watching!